Bricks 2.1 has the potential to reduce our reliance on a few third-party plugins. Some of the features we can expect include the Bricks components as blocks. So now we can move Bricks components and then use them in the Gutenberg editor. We have Bricks templates, wireframes, and design sets. There is the global query and query manager. Now we have the ability to save queries so that we can reuse them in multiple places for easier management. Then we have a front-end form. We have the fluid typography, and the main one we'll be looking at today, we also have the query data from API sources. So let's take a look at how to query data from API sources, as well as some comparison with other plugins that do similar features. Please note that this video will have a few promotions, but it is not a sponsored video. And the first promotion is WP Accessibility Day is coming up in just about 3 weeks. It will be held on the 15th and 16th of October. It's going to be a 24-hour event, which is free, and it will teach you about accessibility. So you can go ahead and see some of the speakers. The one that I'm very excited for is the Accessible Design Patterns for 2025, because we all like to have design patterns, and like I showed that even Bricks is coming up with their design sets and wireframes, so we can get to see how to create accessible design patterns in 2025. So why am I showing this? The example I'm going to look at is that we have some posts from the WP Accessibility Day, and let's say we want to show it on our own website. So it is really easy, and here is the output. So this is from the WP Accessibility Day website, and the output is on my test website. As you can see, it's the same posts that are coming directly from the WP Accessibility Day, and it's really easy to pull in this data now directly using Bricks query data from API. We'll look at some of the limitations that we have currently with the API query. It is still in the early stages, so it is going to be improved, but I'll just mention some of the limitations as we go along. So here we are in the Bricks editor. The API query is just like any other regular query. You start with a block, then you activate the query loop within the settings of that block. Then you go ahead and choose the type as API. I'll click on the API settings, and you can start by giving it a name. In this example, I'll say WPAD 2025. Then the URL is whatever your get URL from your documentation is. In this example, we are using the REST API of WordPress. It's quite simple. You start with HTTPS, then the base URL of the website, /wp-json/wp/v2/your CPT name. In this example is posts. Then the next one is, what method are you using for the HTTP? Is it a GET request or a POST request? For the WordPress API is GET. Then you can choose an authorization, things like the bearer, the referrer, all of those things. In this example, we don't have any of those. Then the header, there is none as well. The next one we're going to add is a URL parameter. But first, let's go ahead and just fetch the data and see what data is being returned. So I'll fetch data, and let me save it. So the data that is returned is going to have this 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. It is very important that you are returning objects, not an array and then objects within that array. It has to be these objects like this with the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if it's a nested object, then you need to first access that array item and make sure that it is returning just plain numbers. Okay, so in this example, it's returning the right thing. The only limitation right now with the standard URL that I put is that you cannot get the featured image. So if you're trying to get featured image along with the post, then you have to add an extra URL parameter, because you see from this example, that when we try to look for something like the featured media, you see that all that is being returned is the ID of our featured image, not the image itself. So how do we get the featured image? Luckily, WordPress gives us the URL parameter we can put called embed. So I'll put underscore embed, that's the name. The value is supposed to be blank, but I think if you leave a blank value here, it doesn't work. So we have to use true. Then you can add an extra one for pagination, because right now we're getting everything. So let's say we want to get only the first 3 items per page. The WordPress API, it uses per underscore page, and then you give it the number. So in this case, 3. So let's go ahead and fetch again. And I see we only have 3 values returned. And if we go down to the very bottom, we'll now see this underscore embedded, and that is where we can now find the featured image. So it embeds the featured image data for us, and that's what we are going to be using. Now we can start using the data. So let me go ahead and save it, and let me just add an extra one for pagination. So when we want to add pagination, we're going to say has pagination, yes. The type for the WordPress one, you can just go to the documentation. Everything is there in the documentation. I'll leave a link to the Bricks documentation in the comments and in the description. So I'll say yes, URL parameter, basically page number. The page parameter is actually page. Total items path is in the header. So you start with header dot, is written in the documentation. Header dot x dash WP and so on. So let's go ahead and copy that. And I'll paste it. So we have the entire recipe set up now. So I can go ahead and save, and I'll close the settings. I've also added in my card. So how do we now start putting in the data? If we know the value, we can put in the data because it uses some dynamic data, which I'll show. Let's go ahead and see the first one. But remembering the names of these dynamic data can be quite hard. So there are 2 options they've given us to add the names. If I go back to the query, go to the settings of the query, and I go ahead and expand the response, what we'll be looking for is, let's say I want to get the value of the title. So it's called title rendered. Once you hover over that value that you want to get, you see 2 buttons. They're icons. So the first one says copy to clipboard, the dynamic data tag, or you can create dynamic data tag. Both of them will give you the same output, but the second method just makes it easy for you to retrieve on the front end. So with the second method, you first of all create some aliases here in these API settings, and then use those dynamic data tags or aliases on the fields that you need. So let's go ahead and create the aliases. So the first one is going to be the title. The second one is our excerpt. So let's go ahead and search for the excerpt. So go back to the top, and we can see excerpt rendered. I'll create the dynamic data tag and call it excerpt. And that's what I'll do for the rest of the data. So I've gone ahead and I've created all of the ones that I need. And I can go ahead and save, and we can start using it in the builder. So now when we come over to the first, which is the heading, I can go ahead and add in my text. If you choose the dynamic data tags, now you can see an option called Query API, and that just gives you all of the data that I created. So the first one is title. The second one is excerpt. And you see, basically, it is just giving us the dynamic data tags, which is something we can do by also copying directly from the API. So both of them will still give you back the same dynamic data tag, which starts with query underscore API and so on. So the next one is the featured image. Then finally, I'll just go ahead and add in a link. So under the link to custom URL, and I'll put in my link. Let me go ahead and save it. Sometimes you might get the flashing image all you have to do is just refresh the page. And now we get everything. So we get our image, our excerpt, and our text. We can also still perform some other filters on the actual element. So I can say, okay, I want it to only return 5 words. So I'll just put column 5. So it still works with everything that Bricks has. So let's just get rid of that. And we get our value back to the full excerpt. Okay. So I can save. And yeah, we're done. The last thing we can do is now add our pagination. And that just uses the regular pagination element. So pagination, go ahead and put it below. And we just have to set the query to be the right query. In this case, it is called item. And there we have it. You can save. We can choose to use Ajax querying if we want, and so on. So let's go ahead and enable Ajax. Save and preview on the front end. So we have our 3 items and I can query. So we have the next 3 items and so on. And yeah, that's a basic example with the API query. You can do other things like query from Airtable and other sources. One thing I like about the Bricks API Query Builder is that you can see the output in the builder. You can use the dynamic data tags easily with any of the elements, and it just feels quite native. The other one that you can use is the Bricksforge version of the Query Builder. That one is currently more powerful because one of the limitations of the regular Bricks API right now is that you can't do nested queries. With the Bricksforge version, you can do nested queries. But the limitation of the Bricksforge version is that you don't see what you are doing in the builder. It is going to be showing just the dynamic data tags, and you have to imagine what the output looks like. So that can be a bit of a hassle for some users. But like I mentioned, it is a bit more powerful. But then there is a limitation that I've noticed with the both of them, is the fact that they require you to use an array of objects. If you try to query a single value or an array of strings, then it doesn't work. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have a simple example from the dog API. It's called dog.ceo. And in this example, we are just returning a single value of the image. So let's go ahead and copy that URL. In Dynamic Toolbox for Bricks, which is a separate add-on, we are able to query those single values. As you can see, the query API is from the dog API, and we are able to query the single values. In this case, I just did /3, which gives me 3 values. If I do /1, it will give me a single value and so on. So it works with single values, with 3 values and so on. But now let's try it with the Bricks version. So I'll go to the block. I'll do the same thing, query loop settings, and this time I'm going to choose the type as API again, API settings, and I'll drop in the name as dog CEO, URL required, paste it. We don't need any other thing. It's just going to be a get request. Let's go ahead and fetch data. And you can see we are fetching the response, message, and status. It's not that 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So in this case, there is basically no way to do it. Say we are trying to drill it down to just the message, and I fetch data, it breaks it because it loops into each individual item, because this is what is expected. It's expected to get 0, 1, 2, 3. So let's go ahead and say, let's try without doing this option and see if we can just get the dynamic data tag for the message. So let me go ahead and copy that tag, save and close. And let's start with the text file so that we can see exactly what's been outputted. Paste. And nothing. we're not getting a response. We can see that there are 2 items, but because there is no actual key that we can use, it's just bricks, basically. So that's one of the limitations of the Bricks API for now. It can't return simple values when it's just a single value that's been returned. I'm not sure how to do it yet. And if it is not an array of objects that don't have keys, so basically those 0, 1, 2, 3 type of arrays, it also is not going to work. So it only works when there is an array of keyless objects, basically. It's also the same limitation with Bricksforge that I've noticed. So Bricksforge, even when you're doing like the nested API response, for example, I have the response from my API table, which has a nested response of plugins. What I did was I have the title, and then I have the different plugins, which has an array within the title. But the second array is an array of strings, not array of objects. So I also get that same limitation with the Bricks and Bricksforge version. You cannot get that nested array. That's where the benefit of the dynamic toolbox for Bricks comes in. So dynamic toolbox for Bricks or dynamic shortcodes, which is what I used in this example here, because I was using a different page builder, but it's still using dynamic shortcodes. And you can see we have nested response. What I mean, this is the nested response. We have a nested array, but that array is an array of strings rather than an array of objects. With the current versions of Bricks and Bricksforge, those don't work. You will need something like dynamic shortcodes or dynamic toolbox for Bricks to work with that. On the other hand, the limitation with dynamic toolbox for Bricks is that you have to write everything in code. If you want to see the response of dynamic toolbox for Bricks, everything is basically written in code. You can't write it using the different nested elements. So each one of these methods, they have their benefits and they have their limitations. So I hope this quick video has been helpful. I'll try to do a better video in the future once things have improved, and I'll look at all the other features that are there within the new Bricks 2.1. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.